As we've been hearing this morning from Washington, the Prime Minister has arrived at the first NATO summit that he's going to attend, where allies will announce new support for Ukraine.
Back home, Sir Keir Starmer is under pressure to increase defence spending urgently. We're joined from Westminster by the newly appointed Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard. Luke Pollard, how would you assess the state of our armed forces? Morning.
Good morning. Well, our armed forces are some of the best in the world, but there's no denying that over the last 14 years, they've been hollowed out and underfunded. We know there's capability gaps across our armed forces, in part because of the equipment and the capabilities that we've supplied quite correctly to our friends in Ukraine to see off the criminal invasion that Putin has orchestrated on that country. But that's why next week we'll be setting out a new strategic defence review to look at the threats the United Kingdom is facing and our allies are facing, and what capabilities we need as a country to match those threats, to deter them, but defeat them if necessary.
There are armed forces professionals, of course, and I'm thinking about the former head of the army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, who could give you a pretty accurate assessment of what they think we need. You have pledged to increase defence spending to 2.5% of national income. However, General Sanders says that's too small. Spending should rise to closer to 3%. The world is facing as dangerous a moment as any time we have had since 1945. Others say you're playing with fire with any delay. Should we not be just cracking on with it?
Well, I have enormous respect for those senior officers that have served our country with real distinction over many years. Their assessment is broadly right. We live in really difficult times. We do need to refresh our armed forces to make sure that we're learning the lessons from Ukraine, to make sure that we can win any battle in the future. But that's why the Defence Review is so important. It's a first step that will start getting our forces in the right shape and to learn the lessons. So, for instance, we need to have more drones and deep strikes. That's the ability to strike far into an opponent's territory. We're seeing that being used very effectively in Ukraine, but their capabilities we need to develop further in the UK armed forces. That's why the review will not only look at what capabilities we need, but what capabilities we can have alongside our allies.
Sorry to interrupt, but how long is it going to take?
Well, we want to see this review delivered at pace. It's really important because of the urgent threats that we are facing.
At pace means when?
Well, in the manifesto, we set out that we want that delivered within the first year of a Labour government, but the Prime Minister has made very clear that he wants it delivered faster. That is now on the Ministry of Defence to work not only with our armed forces, but our allies as well, to put in place a proper deep defence review that not only looks at the capabilities we need, but also drives deep procurement reform, because the Ministry of Defence has, I think most people would agree, not always been very efficient in how it spends its money. Okay. We want to get better value for money out of the huge sums that are spent on defence and make sure that more of that money is spent with British companies. Because in recent years, we've seen multi-billion-pound contracts sent to foreign companies. And as a government, we think that we should be driving growth in our nations and regions. Defence companies are largely based in our nations and regions in areas that don't always have lots of other industry. And there's ability here, if we spend money wisely and in the right sequence, to grow our economy, to build our skills base, and to ensure we have more sovereign capability.
Can I ask about the message that Keir Starmer will be taking to that NATO summit, and particularly to European allies? A few months ago, David Lammy, now the Foreign Secretary, was in Washington meeting Republicans. He said Donald Trump was right to say that European countries aren't pulling their weight when it comes to spending on defence, and they can't expect America to be there if they're not willing to spend. Is Keir Starmer going to tell the NATO summit that Donald Trump is right and that other European countries need to do more?
Well, what I think the Prime Minister will be saying is that every member state in NATO, including all European nations, should be spending at least 2% of their GDP on defence. We see that as a floor, not a ceiling in how much you should be spending on defence. And what you spend it on is as important as the total figure. That means we need to make sure that NATO militaries are more interoperable. That means they can deploy and fight alongside each other. That the systems we use are all interoperable, because at the moment there's lots of different ammunition for different artillery pieces. We need to make sure they have a standardised system so we can fight alongside each other, and that we're supporting the capabilities that are needed to deter Russian aggression. We have UK forces in Estonia at the moment. We have RAF jets patrolling the border between NATO countries and Russia. These are the right commitments for the UK to have to support that alliance, to support our NATO-first approach. But we do need to make sure that we've got the right equipment in the right place and, importantly, the right people. Because while this defence...
But just to ask you about the question I asked, which is about Donald Trump's message and whether the Prime Minister is echoing that. What Trump has said, because there's lots of countries spending less than 2%, he said if they're not willing to spend, then they can't expect NATO and US forces in NATO to stand behind them. I mean, is that the right thing for a potential American president to say? Is that something you would echo?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister will be using those precise words, but what the Prime Minister will be saying, as John He, the Defence Secretary, will be saying, is that we expect all NATO countries to be spending at least 2.2% on GDP. The United Kingdom has a commitment to get to 2.5% of GDP. That should be something that all NATO countries are aspiring to. But that floor, that minimum of 2%, is right that every country spends that in these more difficult
aren't spending that
times.
But what are the consequences if they don't?
Well, that's the pressure that can be applied at a NATO summit like this. When you get leaders of NATO members together, it's an opportunity to reinforce why that matters. And we know that we live in more difficult and uncertain times, especially those countries that border Russia are seeing it firsthand. It's not just the threat that people are facing from artillery and missiles, although that's a real threat, especially for our friends in Ukraine at the moment. It's the fact that NATO members, including the United Kingdom, are under daily cyber attack. So the threats we're facing have evolved over the past few years, and we need to make sure that NATO militaries are not only spending the right amount of money, but spending it well to deter those threats. That means protecting critical national infrastructure, protecting our National Health Service in the UK, as well as protecting Ministry of Defence sites.
Just before we let you go, can I just ask, because of course the Prime Minister will be meeting President Biden, who is our strongest ally over in America when it comes, for instance, to Ukraine? Is it President Biden, with all the criticism of his state of mind and health at the moment, or would it be a President Trump who is less strong in his support for Ukraine?
Well, the United States of America, regardless of whichever party is in the White House, is the UK's #1 ally. It's important that we work with whoever the American people elect in their presidential elections later this year. But let's be absolutely clear, America's security is the same as Ukraine's security. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he won't stop with Ukraine. He will continue to threaten NATO members. He'll continue to threaten the security that we need to grow our economies, because security is economic prosperity, and that it will affect American citizens just as much as it will threaten Polish, Estonian or UK ones. So the collective security that underlines NATO is something that should be respected by every single country, and I would expect whoever wins the White House later this year will understand the value of a strong defence for every NATO member.
I've got to say to you, Mr. Pollard, given what you've just said, a very powerful argument, given we know that Donald Trump is a bit of a sceptic, I think you should get on with spending this money. I mean, we can't afford to sit around, be slow getting our defence spending up if the Americans may not be as reliable after the presidential election as you need them to be. So you need to get on with it, don't you?
Well, that's precisely why we are getting on with it. That's why next week we'll be announcing a strategic defence review that will look at the threats and the capabilities. We need to make sure that we get to 2.5% of our GDP, but we have to get there within our fiscal rules. What we're not going to do is pretend the money is there when it's not. We also need to make sure that the money is spent much better than it's been spent before, more efficiently, putting more resources to the front line, and dealing with the fact that over many years we've had falling morale, a real crisis in retention and recruitment, and these have to be addressed alongside a defence review, because sorting out poor quality military housing that far too many of our armed forces personnel live in at the moment doesn't need a defence review to do. We're cracking on with that work already to make sure that our service personnel have decent equipment, decent housing standards and a decent future in service.
Luke Pollard, it's good to talk to you this morning, Armed Forces Minister. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds like we had an Armed Forces review there on air.
I know.
Doesn't it? But
lots of detail. The trouble is, saying we're having a review doesn't sound like cracking on.